I do speak as a Christian theologian, and that's the angle I'm coming at this from. Let me begin with a parable. But first of all, how many people, without saying the name, put your hand up if you recognise the person on the right? Okay, look around you and see who's recognising them. Okay? You live, sir, in?
St Andrews.
St Andrews.
Strange man.
Let me begin with a parable which I'm calling the parable of Jeremy and Gordon. The Jeremy in question is not Clarkson, but Paxman, the well-known presenter of the BBC Two current affairs programme Newsnight. The Gordon in question, Gordon Brewer, meet Gordon Brewer, is the main presenter of the BBC Scotland programme Newsnight Scotland, fondly referred to where I come from as Newsnicht. Now, there is a reason for putting this up and asking the question about who recognised Gordon Brewer. If I borrowed the current Labour Party attack soundbite, you just don't get it. And I want to deploy that both literally and metaphorically. First of all, most of you just don't get BBC Two Scotland's regional variations. This is not your fault, but it does have certain consequences. Stay with me here. So you settle down with your mug of tea or your glass of Glenfiddich, whichever it is, to watch Newsnight. It comes on at 10:30 and you watch it through more or less sleepily until it stops around 11:20, 11:25. It's a seamless current affairs experience. Not if you live in Glasgow, it's not. Like you, we begin with Paxman, but around 11 p.m. the music plays, the credits roll, and we exit into Newsnicht, replacing Paxman's sneer with Brewer's scowl. The parable emerges from the contrast between watching in Middlesbrough, Minehead or Maida Vale and watching in Motherwell, Moffat or Machrihanish. English viewers just don't get it. They are oblivious. They assume that Newsnight is the same for everyone, everywhere. We know different. And this little media moment deserves to be called a parable because the technical oblivion points, I would suggest, to a social, cultural and epistemological oblivion, which is, if not intrinsic to, then endemic within the mindset of both majorities and empires. This is the tendency to privilege and universalise their own identities and concerns to the point where they efface those of others. It is the mindset of the Babel builders of Genesis 11, where their fascistic dreams involve them in projecting a demonic unity, the city in which difference is effaced and eclipsed by the power of one. Jacques Ellul, in his classic study of the meaning of the city, encourages us to reflect on what we might call the blessings of Babel, on the presence of ethnic, linguistic and cultural diversity as God's providential provision of resources which enable human resistance to imperialism. And for someone like me working within the Reformed tradition, this reading of Genesis 11 connects rather seamlessly with a classic Calvinist vision of the stewardship of creation. This can be expressed, and crucially I want to claim, be expressed popularly and in ways well suited to Christian catechism in terms of a biblical imaginary which funds some key ethical moves. For Christians, there are certain key stories which must always trump all other stories. The narratives of creation and redemption are always trumps within Christian political theology. They lead or even force the conclusions, I would suggest, that we should primarily only make use of the language of race in the singular. We are all, as Hamish Henderson says, the bairns o' Adam, and as C.S. Lewis says, the daughters of Eve. The imago Dei, which is given in creation, undercuts and overcomes all other distinctions. And this image, as it is restored and renewed in redemption, leads also to an insistence on the other great singular of one church, entry into which is by virtue of one baptism, so that for Christian theology, water is always thicker than blood. Here we have to do also with what has recently been engaging the interest of Zizek, Badiou and Agamben in their readings of Paul, the capacity of these particular narrative traditions of Judaism and Christianity to fund and fashion universal claims. After the fragmentation of postmodern identity politics, people are looking for some universal narratives. Claims of common humanity and of liberating election, if you're reading from the Christian tradition, which trump all attempts to place one class, gender, or ethnicity above others. And this capacity to fund universal claims can be filled out from the detail of the Genesis narratives. In the early chapters of Genesis, we are faced with two great sendings. On the one hand, the human race is sent out by God to fill the earth. We are sent into Eden to fill it. And after the fall, human beings are sent out of the garden to make their home east of Eden. And these two sendings suggest two truths about how we belong in the world. The first sending forth to fill the world affirms the value of every place within creation. As the Puritans used to say, every place is immediate unto God. There are no parts of the world which are in principle God-forsaken, not even England. The second sending, the sending out of the garden, when humans are forced to improvise home east of Eden, away from the presence of God, this is a sending out into a world marked by death and violence and insecurity. Every place in this scenario is equally alienated from the presence of God. The Scottish Orcadian poet Edwin Muir wrote of, "Since Eden shut the gate that's everywhere and nowhere. There are no parts of the world which escape the flood. There are no parts of the world which are in principle closer to God than others, not even Scotland." We have then a double theological verdict applied to every place on earth where people make their homes. The insistence that every society is both affirmed and judged. Every place is a place both of vocation and alienation. In every culture, we are both building Enoch and raising Cain. And it is from within and beneath that double verdict that a providential vision of human diversity emerges. We can read that verdict and that vision in Augustinian terms. Every culture represents what Laman Sani calls an authentic destination of God's salvific promise, which he says has an honoured place under the kindness of God. Laman Sani's book, Translating the Message, I think is one of the great theological books of the last 30 years. And if you've not read it, I thoroughly recommend it. I think it's a profoundly important book. Every culture then represents an environment within which God can be loved, and within which love of God or love of self can prevail. There is our double verdict again. And what we're particularly concerned with today is how the dynamics of loving play out in relation to a range of other possible common objects of love. We could borrow Augustine's question and adapt it. What do I love when I love Scotland? What do I love when I love England? What do I love when I love the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? And I want to suggest that reading patriotism in this Augustinian key helps us to move beyond the kind of naive use of it which is made by even highly skilled political theologians. I'm not choosing to target Nigel today. I'm going to target my good friend Luke Bretherton and his Christianity and Contemporary Politics 2010, where he gives, I think, a wholly inadequate account of the relationship between nationalism and patriotism, which roughly translates as Patriotism Good, Nationalism Bad. Now, this kind of woolly ethical shorthand only works when you have assumed outmoded and underthought definitions of your terms. Bretherton simply fails here to be the good Augustinian he calls the rest of us to be, because he assumes it's possible to map patriotism onto the good kind of love and nationalism onto the bad kind. This will surely not do. Both nationalism and patriotism need an Augustinian interrogation of their respective love lives, if they are to be properly considered. And this has to happen not only in general terms, but in particular cases. It has, in other words, to be the work of a critical, practical, political theology. I am very serious about the theoretical and the methodological point I'm making here, which is that political theology can no longer trade in this way in defining what are key terms for its work. It needs to trade up to a more nuanced and critical account of the relationships involved. And in preparation for doing so, it needs to attend to new currents within nationalism studies. The vital prolegomena in this field is Michael Billig's work on banal nationalism. Now, it's vital because there is a degree of willful stupidity, I think, which afflicts debates around nationalism. Yes, there are nationalists in power in Holyrood at the moment, but there are also nationalists in power in Westminster. And critics of explicit nationalism, such as that of the SNP or Plaid, very often struggle and even refuse to acknowledge their own British nationalism. When this is not just partisan dissembling, it's usually an example of Billig's banal nationalism, a kind of nationalism which people simply assume and therefore become blind to because they have become habituated to its constructions and conventions in their daily lives. It's the nationalism of the Newsnight parable, where you simply don't get it. It's also the nationalism which, like the mercies of God, is new every morning on the Today programme, as it thoughtlessly elides England and Britain and allows its political commentary to sail on as if devolution had never happened. And interestingly, and Anthony was an honourable exception today, it seems to be that in relation to Scotland and Wales, black and Asian voices within England, even when they're highly sensitised to discourse which is assuming British or English equals white, are often just as prone to this kind of assumption and exclusion as any other English commentators. So what do you love when you love Britain, my patriot friends? Because it does not appear to me that you love Scotland or even see Scotland most of the time. You may, however, still not love us, but you will see us when you have to find a new English or rest of the UK home for the Trident nuclear deterrent after 2014. It is therefore, as the young people say, time to fess up to our own nationalisms, both in the sense of acknowledging them and in the sense of repenting either of them or in them, depending on how toxic they are. That is a task for us all. And we cannot rely on the depoliticising effects of the term patriotism to excuse us from it. Ian and Bradley and I disagree on some things, but we are agreed on the importance of ritual, symbolism and ceremony in these matters. And I would connect that to the work done on cultural liturgies in James K.A. Smith's wonderful book, Desiring the Kingdom, which I also highly recommend. Smith's main argument is that liturgies shape and form what we love. The transition from patriotism to nationalism is not a journey from virtue to vice. It's a journey from questions of affection or affiliation to questions of, and here I choose Oliver O'Donovan's conceptualisation, representation. Let me say that again. The journey from patriotism to nationalism is not a journey from virtue to vice. It's a journey from questions of affection or affiliation to questions of representation, and to the legitimacy of particular forms of representation. Now, O'Donovan's on his own distinctive journey here, and he's got other fish to fry in this book, but his way of framing the question, I think, is helpful. He says, to ask about the justice with which any particular representative arrangement comes to obtain is to ask about a universal justice, but that is to ask about the kingdom of God, and about the obedience to his rule on the part of a multitude of peoples, tribes and nations, not by one tribe on its own. To each particular identity, then, is put the question, how can the defence of this common good, focused around this common identity at this time and in this way, be brought to serve that common good which belongs to the all-embracing identity, individual and collective, of God's kingdom? And he goes on to say God's kingdom is not, first of all, universal law, but universal representation. The disclosure of Godhead and manhood at the River Jordan, which affords a universal identity in baptism. The representation decisive for God's kingdom is not that of any single nation by its ruler, but the representation of all mankind by the man anointed with the Holy Spirit. Now, I like Oliver's way of framing the question, even if I have doubts about how even-handed he would be in asking it of the Union as opposed to asking it of Scotland. The question then becomes clearer, though not simpler. Given the ethical and political priority of serving God and neighbour, what do I love when I love England or Britain? And that's the patriotism question. And what do I love when I love this set of borders or this system of representation? Seems to me to be the nationalism question. And to address these questions involves rethinking nationalism. Sorry, I had some of my slides in the wrong order here. Jonathan Hearn's book, Rethinking Nationalism is, to my mind, the best recent book on theories of nationalism. Hearns is an American academic, an anthropologist working at Edinburgh University. And Hearns looks at the politics of stable democratic regimes as the routinization rather than the overcoming of nationalism. His argument is that in stable democratic regimes, this process of nationalism is deeply embedded in civil society and electoral systems. It's not simply an elite or state-led process, it's part of the normal functioning of democratic regimes. In this view, then, liberal democracies do not so much transcend nationalism as domesticate it, routinizing its dynamic by channeling it through core political institutions. On the one hand, nationalism is seriously altered by this context, defanged for the most part, and rendered less dangerous. But on the other hand, it's an indispensable part of the state's ongoing need for legitimacy and the inevitable competition between social groups to define the wider society of which they're members. So nationalism for Hearns is a basic part of how relatively stable democracies legitimate and re-legitimate themselves. He follows Beetham in tracing this process of legislation through voting, conformity to rules, and justification of rules in terms of shared beliefs and values. And notes also Roger Smith's characterisation of these as stories of peoplehood. And he agrees with Bobbio that civil society is the space of delegitimation and re-legitimation. Hearns argues that when political parties compete to win votes, they do this by making claims to represent the entire national population, defining its interests and values in terms of the party's interests and values. In this way, far from transcending nationalism, normal democratic party politics keeps national identity on a constant slow boil. Very important phrase, I think. Nationalism is an essential resource for the maintenance of legitimacy in democratic regimes. And the quote goes on there. And he also cites Billig's work, arguing that nationalism is not just residual background noise, it's a key legitimising resource that can be activated and brought into the foreground, for example, during times of war and other social crises. Nationalism for Hearns is not a strange and exotic creature. It's part of the normal functioning of democratic regimes. Above all, it's a key part of how they legitimise themselves. A critical patriotism is one of the resources we bring to this process of legitimation. But it is no more intrinsically innocent than nationalism is intrinsically evil. And I'm working on a book just now on the ethics of nationalism, which is going to be called Honey from the Lion. You'll recognise the reference to the Samson narratives in Judges 14 in particular. And I draw on that as a metaphor for the question of legitimation, the relationship between power and virtue. My argument is that structures of power and governance always need to be broken in order to release sweetness. In the case of the beast of nationalism, this breaking involves a rejection of absolutism, of imperialism, and essentialism. In other words, in Augustinian terms, it's a refusal to love my nation more than God, it's a refusal to love my nation more than your nation, and it's a refusal to love one co-national neighbour more than another. I say in the case of nationalism, but in fact those qualifications seem to me to apply equally to patriotism. If discipleship in political terms is learning to love what God loves and our neighbours above all, both the affective and the representative dimensions of life and society stand under the call and the judgment of God. The primary theological test for patriotism and nationalism is whether they serve the kingdom and mission of God. The primary ethical test is whether they enable internal mobilisation for the common good and external relationships of peace and justice. What is neither necessary nor helpful is to avoid the language of nationalism or to believe that a discourse centred on patriotism can be a substitute for it. The news from Scotland is that many of us within the parties which support independence are committed to a humble, mutual, peaceful, green, internationalist nationalism, which is committed to seeking social justice and dispensing with weapons of mass destruction. There are many loves driving that political project, and some of them go beyond patriotism. They bring resources of faith and hope to the shaping of common objects of love. I hope that independence can be welcomed as a liberating option for Scotland and England. that it can open a future in which Scotland's lion rampant is not a predatory and devouring beast, but one in which we, like Samson, can get honey from the lion's belly, and about which we can tell this theopolitical riddle. Out of the strong came something sweet. Out of the eater came something to eat. Thank you very much.